This is the very final sliver of learning and memory, and some of it I've kept from a previous semester. So that very last slide, I think I'm talking to my spring 2020 class when we went online suddenly. But I do want to say just where we were. So we were talking about the role of glutamate, those AMPA receptors, those NMDA receptors, and what allowing that calcium in to the postsynaptic neuron, what that allowed for. And now we're going to move on to talking about also the presynaptic neuron. We also do see changes in the presynaptic neuron as well, as extensive stimulation of a postsynaptic neuron is going to cause the release of a retrograde transmitter. That nitric oxide is going to travel back to the presynaptic cell. If you remember, that fit in to tell the presynaptic cell that, hey, you've sent enough neurotransmitter, but what it's also doing is it's allowing for some of the following changes. So a lowering of the action potential threshold. So I can now, as the presynaptic neuron, I can now respond with less depolarization, an increase in neurotransmitter release, an expansion of the axons, which is what we saw in that really early long-term potentiation slide in that picture. And then it can also release neurotransmitter from additional sites. And so again, now strengthening that synapse. We just talked about what's happening at the postsynaptic neuron. This is what's happening at the presynaptic neuron. Both of those neurons, we can see cellular change in them so that it's changing the wiring between the neurons, or the communication between the neurons. Long-term potentiation is important for certain kinds of learning. We see many of these kinds of receptors in the hippocampus and the amygdala, and places where we see the kind of learning that we've just been talking about. But over time, there does appear to be a shift to the cerebral cortex, and really we're storing information in the cerebral cortex. And that shift is not very well understood at this point. Okay, so he ends this section of learning and memory discussing improving memory and how we can do that. And as many biological textbooks do, he discusses drugs and some of those transcranial magnetic stimulation, or how we can excite neurons, which some of that is so new and so questionable as to the long-term effects. But even with the drugs, we're going to say it's pretty questionable as to the long-term effects of really improving our memory. He starts with caffeine, Ritalin, methylphenidate, other stimulants. The Ritalin and the ADHD drugs that people are sometimes being prescribed and then selling to others, especially in college, because people want this ability to pay attention and be aroused while they are studying for an exam. Those are really short-term effects. And caffeine as well, there appears to be a plateau with caffeine where we can really be taking away our ability to have focused attention if we are drinking too much caffeine. And it does not make up for just sleeping well. As I think at the very end of this chapter, he says the best thing to do is to get exercise, eat right, and sleep well. So those are really important things, really, for improving memory. And again, those drugs that he's discussed are really short-term, what I'm going to do right now as I'm studying, and it is not clear whether that means you're going to have better memory for that material sometime later in the future, and what the long-term effects are. And in fact, many people are abusing some of those drugs. He discusses here ginkgo biloba and says that the research on this is really questionable. I will agree with that. Ginkgo biloba, first of all, is something that you would be taking for months before you even considered maybe seeing an improvement of memory, and it appears to be pretty subtle. I have looked into this a bit, as one of the books I've read about improving memory he does suggest ginkgo biloba and improving a lot about our brain. He suggests taking ginkgo biloba. What I've noticed about the people who are recommending ginkgo biloba is kind of what I've noticed, honestly, in the meditation research. I am very pro meditation and pro ginkgo biloba, but when I go and look up the research, there are people finding that these things help in whatever we're interested in, and I'm going to stick with the ginkgo biloba and memory, and there are people who say there's no influence at all. And the people who say these things help seem to have a vested interest in finding that outcome. And so the research is really questionable, in my opinion. But I take ginkgo biloba because I would do anything, as I've already discussed the Alzheimer's in my family, and you might be able to tell that my memory is really important to me. And I'm 50 years old, and I used to have almost an eidetic memory, and so now I have this. I can see where my memory lapses as I'm aging, and I hate it. That's the thing I never wanted to lose, as I had an excellent memory. Another herb that he discusses in the book is called Bacopa monnieri, and I don't have that on the slide because it wasn't something that I had heard of or looked up at all. But this is a water hyssop, and this is something that has been used in India in Indian medicine since the is it the 700s AD for improving memory and attentional skills. This is another. I'm not sure what the research is on this. It's kind of questionable, and it's another one of those herbs that it's going to take more like a month or months to see any influence of that at all. But from what I've been watching now, because I've never looked this one up, it does appear to have those antioxidant effects, and because that is so important for fighting cancers as well, and because antioxidants are so good for the brain, I'm going to probably go look into that quite a bit more. I think I know he ends by saying the best things to do for your memory are eat well, exercise, and sleep well. I know aerobic exercise, we see an improvement in memory, and we're going to talk about that one more time when we talk about how exercise helps depression, that we're seeing the same kind of boost in the neurons, in the neurogenesis in the hippocampus, which is really important for memory. But another really good thing to do to improve our memory is to study really well in the first place and develop the strategies that help us the most. I'm not going to say things against flashcards. A lot of people use flashcards. I never used flashcards, but as I just said, I never studied a great deal as my memory was just really, really quite good. But one of the things, but flashcards are this real, if I want to remember this for the test tomorrow, I'm going to just memorize some definitional things. Whereas what we want to do when we're really learning, when we're really building the semantic space, first of all, we want to build the semantic space so that when we learn something new, it fits nicely into that semantic space, and we're more likely to remember it. But one of the ways to do this is to really develop questions. So I have had one book that suggests that you go and write the chapter headings and the subchapter, all of those little headings, write them out. Just so if I go and look at a couple of these, I would say AMPA, NMDA synapses, presynaptic changes, improving memory, and develop curiosity. So maybe write out a couple of questions for yourself that you might have. And what's even better is to give yourself some potential answers for those questions, and then go and read. And because what we're doing when we're developing curiosity is we are seeing activity across more of the brain than when we are just mindlessly kind of passively reading. And when we come up with a question, we come up with an answer, and then we go and we find out that that answer was wrong, and we hear the right answer, we lay down those memories the best. That is one of the reasons I partly give the test corrections to help my students, because sometimes the exams are really hard, and it's really hard material, and you just having that second chance to come back and look up information can help your grade, but more it is to improve your memory. And I feel like some of those students who don't do so well the first time and go back and find those answers, they're more likely to remember those answers, the ones that they got wrong and had to go look up the correct answer, than anything else on the exam. So these are the ways really to improve your memory is by finding that curiosity, which helps with all of that arousal and attentional and all of those pieces and parts that play into laying down a new memory. All right, that is my end of learning and memory. I know I've gone on more than I wanted to, and so at this point, I'm going to skip cognition. We have done pieces and slices of this throughout perception, throughout when we talked about conscious versus unconscious, and more recently in learning and memory as well. There has been overlap, and I've taken parts of this chapter, so the only thing I'm really missing in cognition is some of the basics behind language. I'm a language person. It bothers me a little bit, but I know it's time to move on to psychological disorders so that we can get through the psychological disorders. That's usually what students are very interested in. So we're going to start talking today about either schizophrenia or depression. I'll have to go see.